couldn't get the consulate to help her out, welcome to the new reality. So I'm here for her. I don't normally like to speak at my own conferences for papers. So this is more of a strategic view, trying to understand the same types of questions that so many of you are asking for today, thinking about tech. And I want to actually focus on some of the motivating factors, which go to things that our practitioner panel, I think, handled very nicely. So what's different with regard to tech? It's also a question that Mario asks with his co-authors, who coincidentally, another work than my co-authors, because that's how you find whether or not it's complementary or substitute. So it's like Mario's my academic cousin or brother. It's just we've never worked together. Um, so focusing, because Kelly was the first one to really talk about what's different in tech. So one, how do we think about this kind of work? Ecosystems are being used in all kinds of ways that are positive, maybe also negative. But we're using complementary capabilities. The literature, the empirical literature has many papers on that. These, in fact, are different than, to say what Rebecca mentioned earlier, these are different than railroads and credit cards. But if we look at that earlier work, we've seen the network effects are a bit more nuanced. Both the theory platform work and, more importantly, the empirical work tell us that. And we know that data matters. And we're dealing with different types of ecosystems. So let's complicate things even further, but that's because Carmelo is one of the people who focuses a lot on specific ecosystems. And this is the make or buy decision that we talked about. There's nothing new here. This is Coase, 1937. This is Williamson, 1975. We got the question about contracts. I'll actually make that question a little more interesting. How is it that Williamson, who writes the 1968 merger guidelines and says, well, if the merger is anti-competitive, you could use a contract, but couldn't think about the alternative because, well, what if the contract is anti-competitive, to the point that Diana was mentioning earlier? So Williamson has been out-Williamsoned by Williamson. But the basic theme of make versus buy is not new. We just saw Mario with a really wonderful understanding. And does it work differently in this world of platform ecosystems with network effects and complementarities, these scope complementarities? That's the question, because that really motivates how we should be thinking about such acquisitions from the standpoint of the firm. There are policy implications here, but our focus is on the firm and firm level strategy. That's our slant, not the law. And the reality that we all teach about now is that you do it by yourself. That isn't necessarily helpful. There's a lot of work in this space. We had John's former boss say we don't think that mergers are a good thing. That turns out not to be accurate as a either theoretical or empirical matter. We know that buying does matter, potentially. Sometimes we buy disastrous things at the firm level, but right now we're trying to tell the happy story. Why no one begins at an M&A process and says, we want to buy crap. It's always, we want to buy something that we think is going to make the firm better. Why? Because we have to listen to our shareholders and we have to grow. Then we get the killer acquisitions, and we're trying to deal with the harms versus the benefits, and we see that these are complicated questions, and this is beautiful that killer acquisitions, which we saw in the pharma setting, migrates to our platform setting more than anything else. Like the number of people who still talk about this in pharma is pretty much nobody. But the people who talk about this all the time, Everybody in platforms and also Killzone. Oh, we're going to see a wonderful paper about Killzone. What a shame that I didn't technically know that the paper was in draft form that I could cite to it, but of course we will cite to your paper by the time we submit. And the hard question is, how do we separate these two out? It's a fundamental question. So we have a schematic. From the complementary asset perspective, I'm not telling you anything that you haven't already seen. But this is something that goes back. Matt Higgins is now here at University of Utah. So what I noticed that ecosystem modularity matters, but what's different here, and I think this is what many of you have been saying in your comments, the market is moving fast. Kelly, I'm just going to describe it to you because you're the other one here from the first session. The one thing that's hard to measure as an empirical matter is the tacit knowledge. So I want to just throw that out there. Why is it hard? Because we can't measure things we want to measure. And so it turns out we need talent. So sometimes it's acqui-hire, sometimes it's other stuff. So here's what we do. We come with a flow chart because we thought that might be useful. So first question you ask is, what's the business question you're trying to solve here? You're trying to grow. Do you have the existing capabilities? Let's assume that the answer is no, you don't, because you're growing, fast-moving market. You could focus on the make strategy. We can do it ourselves. If we can address it through internal resources, there's no reason to go out and acquire. But if you can't address it through internal resources, we think make is going to be too slow, so we go to buy. So one of my examples that we don't use in the paper is initially, I'll give you an example why it's good. Uber decided to acquire Drizzly. I don't want to focus on the horizontal components where they were in the same market. The idea of like, oh, wouldn't it be great if you're buying tacos that you could also buy beer with those tacos, right? True complementarity. Why? Because beer goes well with tacos. But what's the problem? The problem is it takes 2 to 3 years to get all of those regulatory licenses to be able to sell beer. You can't easily do it. Then a few years later, Drizzly disappears within Uber. Is that a killer acquisition? No, they bought it for the licenses. We've seen this. We saw this in the 1990s for telecom, right? We buy companies for the licenses, even beyond that point. But what happens if make is not costly? Then we can have alternative strategies, including things just short of the of merger through some kind of alliance or JV contract, etc. Let's say the answer is yes. Does the target's firm complement the existing offerings rather than substitute? If the answer is no, that would look potentially like a killer acquisition. So, which are the different kinds of things that we're trying to actually do in the acquisition? And this is really what's been missing in a kind of holistic way in the literature. Each of these has a separate decision function depending on what we're looking at. How are we going to use it? You'd like to think that there's an integration strategy. If none, but we think that it is truly necessary, then you modify that strategy, gets us back there. Could be viewed as anti-competitive? Well, then we have problems, and then boom. Will it lead to sustained market growth? Boom. So that's basically the entire list. I'm not going to go through it in more detail, just for you to, someone wants to take a snapshot, I'm sure. Not for my mom. But actually, I have the slides. You would proceed along these lines. This is how a business should think about these issues. It takes into the non-legal, the non-market strategies, etc. Now, we also did some work We use PitchBook rather than Crunchbase. But one thing that's changed over time, particularly in tech acquisitions, is that you're keeping the standalone company after the fact, like Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. And we're seeing it particularly in tech markets. We're not seeing it in pharma. And this is where we're still collecting data on some other stuff. So this is just some descriptive data that I think is helpful. And we give you a whole set of different kind of representative case studies. And sort of what works, and I know I'm running out of time, like a minute, 3 minutes. So we create another sort of schema to figure this out. I want to just quickly go through 3 of them. This is your acqui-hire story. Using our framework, we think buy makes sense, low regulatory risks, and even though Google discontinued Polar's services, they kept the people, right? Good acqui-hire story. So this one is a more problematic one. This one actually got not just a serious look in Europe, but like really all the way to the courts. And as you might imagine, for the complicated cases, there are aspects of both pro and anti-competitive that happen. Skype, as you know, has disappeared. Do we say that this is a killer acquisition because many years later it disappears? Probably not. Although there's some that seem to think yes. In fact, it still seems to be the case that buy was more efficient than make. First, and we have all sort of the schema that explains it, but again, 14 years later, we get the shutdown. Now I focus on one of my favorites that had bad docs that we got some complaints about before, but there was more than bad docs. There was Carl Shapiro explaining that, in fact, there was real coercion on the part of the merging parties. Like literally, I cannot create worse documents than the ones in this case. Like, but they were Texans, and they're like, we're going to crush our competitors in a way that is culturally less sensitive. And here, this is the killer acquisition. Everyone says, where's the killer acquisition? It really did happen. We actually saw it litigated. But somehow we don't frame it as a killer acquisition. But it was. And it unwinds the deal. So if we do the step-by-step analysis, we take some examples with larger companies. We do have some that are actually not problematic, including some high-profile ones. Amazon, Whole Foods, there's a similar one. It was basically Walmart, and I forget what the name of the company was, but it's basically a traditional retailer going into online, kind of same thing. But we actually have some that are really anti-competitive. And your former associate now being NVIDIA's antitrust counsel. I know. Yeah. So that's where we are. So I'm going to stop there because actually, Kelly, my guess is that you have some thoughts of, actually, these don't look so killer. Which ones did you work on?
Neither.
Oh, it's all Chatham House rules.
I do AMD work, so I'm touching you.
Okay. So does this kind of schema work in a real world setting? Because it can't be that the number of killer acquisitions is 0. I'll start with that. And so how do we create a workable framework? Because companies need to know, because they need to go.
Yeah, well, so I mean, there's like two. We now use the phrase like killer acquisition and then like reverse killer acquisition, and reverse killer acquisition feels less problematic than killer acquisition, where you're literally just buying it so that it doesn't exist. A variation on that might be buying it so your competitors can't have it. Like I don't want to have that toy. The reverse killer acquisition seems a little weird to me, which is this. That's where the make versus buy really starts. It starts to be just looks. These deals look so much like logical decision to just invest resources efficiently to get product to market faster. So I really struggle with those. As those 3 things seem all very different. but and variations of all of them exist. I would say most of them look more like a basic make versus buy decisions, which are totally benign, get mistake in particular acquisitions too often, in my opinion.
So related to that, I think there is a very nice paper in Finance by Phillips and Dano for 2013, which gets at that make versus buy, and now they argue that like it's too costly for large firms to engage in R&D races with small firms, and so actually buying rather than making, it's efficient.
It's
So that's kind of like that's about the reverse
well, and a lot of
position.
times, I mean, I think there's a fourth variation here where you've got some sort of like thing you're trying to launch or do at the company, but there's like a small subset of people who are in the universe who are smart enough to figure it out. And like the smartest person has proved their ability to figure out by like starting a baby version. And a lot of times these startups are really just like proof of concept. This happens in AI all the time. They prove how like smart they are by doing something that like nobody really wants. And as a result, their little company gets acquired, but it's really or Augmenter just for the talent and the ideas of making some of the volumes.
So I'll play it somewhat differently to what you're saying, which is that we have decided if we are a large firm, instead of taking on the risk ourselves, the R&D race is better conceptualized as we'll just look at proof of concept of somebody else and acquire them at that time so that we're shifting risk to them. Because the alternative is you get on this earnings call and you say, we have just blown through $800 million from proof of concept. And I'm like, so what does that do to your earnings?
Yeah.
Oh! Whereas you acquire them, by the way, the acquisition itself helps for your earnings call because it looks like you're growing. And you may actually be acquiring the technology as well. You've shifted all potential losses to other parties where, frankly, it's a badge of honor. Like, oh my God, we've lost $2 billion in the last 2 years, but we are growing and we are getting closer to acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, shareholders don't like risky bets, right? So, and then the other thing is with some of these things, like, let's say there's 10 people in the world who can develop an AI algorithm that somehow figures out, like, I'm trying to think of something stupid for AI and everybody can ever buy. Your optimal lipstick color for any given moment in time based on photo. And you want that for your company, right? So like, if there's 10 people in the world that can figure this out, the probability that you hired the 1 out of 10 is 1 out of 10. Or the one who's going to do the best job, 1 out of 10, right? So there's 9 other people out there that might be better than the one you hired. So why don't you see how well 9 do and then pick the one that was like doing the best? Once you've figured out, once you've kind of let the market sort out which technology is the best one. Now that assumes obviously that like that person would go on to found some company that would massively disrupt competition in the ecosystem, but in all likelihood, they're out there looking to get acquired anyway.
Other thoughts? Does this work? John?
Well, Dan, it's difficult for me. I think it's a kind of optimistic, which is something I really like. You're an optimistic person. I guess if I were thinking about this, if I were running a company, at step 1, just because I answered no, I don't think I would be ready to go down the path that you've diverted us off. It's great because I might not be facing a critical growth challenge, but I might be facing a critical threat from a rising upstart. I still might want to go down the acquisition decision path. So I think there's beauty of simplicity. Although this is a complicated flowchart, it's relatively simple for this complicated.
Right.
So I'm just not sure.
So basically, it would be growth or threat.
I think that would probably be a nice addition if you could fit it on the slide.
So my initial response is thinking actually about the first panel, what we noticed different about platforms today. It took basically a decade for the econ theory work to suggest that platforms would have multi-homing on both sides. And why did they not, for the most part, do that in the papers? Because it made things too complicated. But potentially we could do that, just say, maybe you're responding to threat. Or maybe threat then gets to, so there's threat as it might affect growth, but there may be just threat that has nothing to do with growth.
Maybe it's another filter.
Yeah.
So thanks for this. I would love to be able to get all these slides. So again, 10,000 foot view, I think there's two sort of parallel path areas of research here that are incredibly valuable to both the business community and enforcers. So for enforcers, we have this new concern in the merger guidelines about serial acquisitions. It's really light on detail, like how do you identify a serial acquisition? What would you look for? And that's not the only one in the guidelines that's light on detail. The other one is trends towards concentration. That's really light on detail. And given that the courts pay close attention to the guidelines, they're not binding on the courts, but they hew to the guidelines. We want to be able to, from the enforcement side, to put some meat on the bones of how to spot a serial acquisition from an antitrust enforcement perspective. So, I think the earlier paper, helps in that regard. But the other side of the coin, of course, is how do you advise clients internally, right, on what to avoid? How to not attract antitrust scrutiny to your acquisitions. And this is, I think, where this comes in and is very, very helpful. So I'm just looking at sort of the practical applications, the policy applications of empirical academic research, which again plays a really important role.
I think we're up on time. But, okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone.